The 214th year of Telachar began, as every year began, with an auction. Excavation Prefect Suvane Dral watched it from the scaffolding of the Ascension Spire, 3 kilometers above the oldest streets of the capital, while the wind pulled at the ceremonial banners of the Ossarin Concord. Below, in the Plaza of Settlement, the Archon's criers were selling human relics to the great houses. A drinking vessel, dented, stamped with a flag of stripes and stars, went for 11,000 standards. A field radio, gutted and mounted on polished stone, went for 6,000. A child's shoe, preserved in resin, went for 30. The crowd laughed at the shoe. They laughed every year. It was tradition to laugh, the way it was tradition for High Archon Metellus Vor to close the Festival of Settlement with the same sentence his predecessors had used for 2 centuries. We thank the extinct tenants for the land. The extinct tenants. Suvane had grown up on that phrase. Every Ossarin child had. The species that had once held this world, humans, the archives called them, a minor bipedal race from an unremarkable arm of the galaxy, had lasted 6 days against the Concord's 3rd subjugation fleet. 6 days, and then the colony called Halden's Rest had gone dark, and the Concord had built its capital on the ashes because the harbors were good and the bedrock was strong, and because building your throne on your enemy's grave was, the founders had agreed, excellent politics. Suvane was not thinking about politics. She was thinking about the door. Her crews had found it 8 days earlier, at a depth of 3.1 kilometers, while sinking the anchor piles for the spire's western foundation. Ground sound imaging had promised bedrock. Instead, the boring head had screamed, sheared 4 cutting teeth, and stopped dead against a surface that returned the drill's own vibration in a pattern too regular to be stone. They had excavated around it by hand after that, the way you excavate around something you have decided not to understand yet, and what they uncovered was a slab of gray alloy 9 meters tall, set into the living rock, without a seam, without corrosion, without a single century of age on it. There was writing across the slab. Human writing. Suvane had seen enough looted relics to know the blocky script. The Concord's oldest translation engines, the ones built during the war itself, rendered it in 4 seconds. Continuity Vault 31. In trust for the people of Halden's Rest. And beneath the words, smaller, in the same patient script, established year 1 of occupation. Year 1 of occupation, not year 1 of the colony. Suvane read the line 11 times before she allowed herself to understand it. The vault had not been built by the doomed colonists in some final desperate week. It had been finished after the Concord arrived, while the fleet was in orbit, while the capital's first foundations were being poured overhead. Whoever had built it had watched the conquerors move in, and had kept working, and had signed the work with a date, the way a craftsman signs a piece he expects to be examined. She filed no report for 8 days. She told herself she was verifying the find. The truth, which she admitted only much later, before the tribunal, was simpler. She had stood in front of that inscription and felt, for the first time in her life, that her civilization was being watched by something with better records. On the 8th night, while the festival fireworks stained the sky above her excavation shaft, Suvane stood alone before the slab and noticed what her instruments had been telling her for a week and what she had refused to log. A light, small and steady, burning above the door's center line. The light was not old, the light was on. She raised her hand, she would say later, only to feel the surface. She never touched it. Because the door was not locked from the outside, there was no mechanism on the outside at all, and as her palm crossed the final centimeter of air, a tone sounded from somewhere deep inside the alloy, unhurried, almost courteous, like a bell acknowledging a guest. Something in there had heard the knock 2 centuries ago. Something in there had been waiting for it to be answered. At dawn on the 9th day, every public screen in Telachar, the festival boards, the transit displays, the Archon's own address towers, 41 million private terminals, went dark for 1 second and returned with a single line of text, in flawless High Ossarin, centered, unsigned, the audit begins. 3 words, no demand, no threat, no explanation of who was speaking, or from where, or with what right. The Ministry of Order announced within the hour that the intrusion was a prank by dissident students and that 4 arrests had been made. The arrests were real. The students were innocent, and the ministry knew it, because the ministry's own engineers had traced the transmission and found that it had not entered the network from anywhere. It had come from beneath the network, from the trunk lines themselves, from the foundations. At noon, the screen spoke a second time, and this time there was a voice, level, unhurried, speaking Ossarin with the faint accent of someone who had learned it by listening for a very long time. "Good afternoon. My name is Elias Marr. I am the custodian of Vault 31. I would like to come up now, please." Then, politely, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world, "You may send whomever you wish to open the door. It has never been locked." 214 years earlier, in the fourth day of a 6-day war, General Ione Castellan had stood in a tunnel under Halden's Rest and signed the ugliest document of her life. It was designated Directive 77K, dated by the old Earth calendar, and its first paragraph conceded in writing what her government would never concede aloud. The colony could not be saved. The Ossarin Third Subjugation Fleet held orbit with 214 capital vessels. The colony's defense registry, filed with the Interstellar Accords 9 years earlier, listed Halden's Rest at 4% of its true industrial capacity, a lie of Castellan's own authorship, told for exactly this day, but even the true figure could not break a siege of that weight. The colony would fall. Directive 77K was not about preventing that. It was about what the falling would purchase. Castellan had spent 11 years building things underneath other things. It was her particular genius, noted in her academy file by an instructor who meant it as criticism. This officer prepares for defeats she has not yet been assigned. She had been 31 when she first briefed the Colonial Defense Committee on what she called continuity architecture, and the minutes of that meeting record that 2 committee members walked out, calling the plan defeatist. Castellan let them go and addressed the remainder in the flat voice her staff learned to dread more than shouting, "Defeat is a season. Extinction is a choice. I am asking for the budget to refuse the choice." She got the budget. It was hidden across 9 fiscal years in line items for water reclamation, deep crust mining surveys, and a permanently unfinished orbital dockyard whose sole purpose was to be photographed by enemy reconnaissance while the real tonnage went underground. Under her direction, human survey ships quietly established 31 continuity vaults on 31 worlds along the Concord's projected line of expansion, projected by her staff, from shipping data and fuel depot placements, 6 years before the Concord fired its first shot. Her intelligence section did not steal Concord war plans. It did something more patient. It bought, over a decade, the freight manifests of 6,100 civilian haulers and read the future in fuel allocations. An empire cannot hide where it intends to go, Castellan wrote in the directive's annex. It can only hide when. We will not need to know when. Each vault held a genetic archive of 1.2 million cataloged lines, a seed library, a fabrication core, a communications route, and 1 living custodian in deep stasis. Each was buried below the depth at which any species bothers to survey, because no one digs 3 kilometers to check for ghosts. And each was built deliberately, directly beneath the ground the enemy would find most desirable, the good harbors, the strong bedrock, the natural capitals. Her engineers protested that this doubled the construction risk. Castellan's reply is preserved in the directive's margin in her own hand. Conquerors are predictable. They will want the best ground, and they will want it because we had it. Put the vaults where their pride will build the roof for us. Vault 31 was the deepest, the largest, and the only one Castellan visited in person. She arrived on the 5th day of the war, with the sky already burning, escorting a man of 34 named Elias Marr, not a soldier, not a scientist of rank, but the colony's chief auditor, a man whose entire career had been the patient reconciliation of accounts. When her staff questioned the choice, Castellan's reply went into the record in 9 words. "I don't need a warrior down there. I need a witness." Marr had asked her, in the lift on the way down, why she was so certain the Concord would never find the vault. Castellan had watched the depth gauge for a while before answering. "In year 1, they'll be too busy celebrating," she said. "In year 10, too busy building. By year 50, the story that you were extinct will be a founding myth, and empires do not excavate their founding myths. They will hold a festival on your grave, auditor, every single year, and every year the festival will make the digging less likely. Their contempt is our camouflage. I've done the projections. The safest place in the galaxy for the human race, as of this week, is directly underneath their throne." End quote. The vault's mine she named the Ledger. It was not a weapon. Its charter, written by Custodian herself and sealed into its core, forbade it from initiating harm. Its task was narrower and colder: observe, record, preserve, and transmit. Every sensor thread it grew, and it was designed to grow, patiently, a few meters a year, into whatever was built above it, would feed a single continuous account. Every human name recovered from the colony's rolls would be entered on one side of that account. Every act committed on the ground above would be entered on the other. "They will build on us," Custodian told Marr in the last hour before his stasis. "Conquerors always build on the grave. It saves them the trouble of remembering it's there. Let them. Every cable they lay, every pipe they sink, every foundation they pour, the Ledger will touch it, and tap it, and learn it. In 50 years their capital will be standing on our nervous system and calling it bedrock." "And me?" Marr asked. "You sleep until the account can be settled. Not avenged, settled. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole point. Revenge burns the books. Settlement opens them. When you wake, you will be the only human being with legal standing on this world, and you will walk up those stairs and present the bill." She shook his hand, which surprised him, and held it a moment longer than protocol required. "You'll be alone a long time," she said. "Longer than me, longer than everyone you've met. I won't pretend that's fair, but someone has to be the signature on the account, and machines can't sign. Sleep well, Auditor. You are now the most patient weapon my species has ever built, and you will never fire a shot." Went out. The last transmission Custodian ever sent went out on the 6th day, on a civilian band, to the refugee convoys running dark toward the Deep Rim. 61 ships, 118,000 people, the seed of whatever humanity would become out there. It contained the coordinates of nothing, the names of no one, and a single instruction that human children on far worlds would grow up reciting without knowing its origin. "Endure quietly. The account is being kept." She was killed 9 hours later at the Halden's Rest spaceport, covering the last 3 refugee launches with a garrison of 400 volunteers. The Concord's after-action report, captured much later, noted with professional irritation that the defenders had fought without strategic purpose. The report was filed by an officer who did not know and never learned that the strategic purpose had already left the surface, and that some of it was sleeping under his boots. The Concord's own records show that its foundation engineers twice detected anomalous conductivity in the deep rock under Telachar, once in year 12, once in year 40, and twice wrote it off as mineral deposit. The second report bears a supervisor's annotation, initialed and stamped, that survives today in the Museum of the Audit under glass. No further survey recommended. Nothing lives at that depth. For 214 years, the Ledger kept the account. It logged the Festival of Settlement 214 times. It logged the auction of 9,406 human relics, with buyers' names and hammer prices. It logged the demolition of the human cemetery in year 3, and the identity of the officer who ordered the headstones ground for aggregate. It logged 1,844,209 names of the dead of Halden's Rest, recovered from its own archived census, and against them it logged every speech, every decree, every laughing broadcast in which the Concord thanked its extinct tenants. It grew into the capital's power grid in year 31, its water system in year 44, its orbital defense route in year 78, its fleet dispatch network in year 122, and the private correspondence servers of the Council of Nine in year 160, an intrusion the Ledger annotated, with what its human readers later insisted was dryness, as necessary for completeness of the record. It took nothing. It changed nothing. It transmitted its account once every 100 days, compressed into the noise floor of the Concord's own relay chain, out toward the Deep Rim, to whoever was left to receive it. Someone was left. And year after year, in the dark beyond the Concord's maps, the receipts were being read. Elias Marr came up in the excavation lift with his hands folded, wearing the plain gray suit he had been sealed in, pressed that morning by the vault's fabricators. He was 34 years old and 248 years old, and the first thing he did at the surface was stand for a moment in the wind, eyes closed, breathing air that no living human had breathed. Suvane Dral was there, at the shaft head, because she had refused to be anywhere else. Marr looked at her identification badge, then at her face, and said, in careful Ossarin, Prefect Dral, you didn't report the door for 8 days. She braced for the accusation. Instead, he inclined his head slightly. The ledger noted that you also stopped the auction house from surveying the shaft. That is on the correct side of the account. Thank you. Then he asked, courteously, to be taken to whoever was in charge, and because 41 million people had watched his request on their screens, refusing was no longer among the Concord's options. They received him in the Hall of Settlement, beneath the frieze celebrating the 6-day war. High Archon Metellus Vor stood on the raised floor with the Council of 9 behind him and 300 guards along the walls, and he opened with contempt, because contempt had never once failed his line. You are a relic, the Archon said, a janitor of a dead race, 2 centuries late for its funeral. State your business and be catalogued. My business is an audit, Marr said. He did not raise his voice. Those who were present would say afterward that he never, at any point, raised his voice. I am required to inform you that this proceeding is being recorded, though I should be honest, everything already was. He set a small slate on the floor of the hall, and the ledger began to read. It read the account backward, starting with the previous morning, the auction, the hammer prices, the name of the noble who had bought the child's shoe, and the name of the child who had worn it. Mira Halden Voss, age 6, entry 1,002,554, and the fact that the noble's grandfather had bought the same shoe at the year 160 auction, and his grandfather before him at year 97, the same laugh recorded 3 times across 3 generations, time-stamped. It read the Archon's festival speech and appended the identical speeches of his 11 predecessors. It read the aggregate order from year 3, and named the parade boulevard whose roadbed still contained the ground headstones, and gave the boulevard's name, which was Triumph. It read the supervisor's annotation from year 40, nothing lives at that depth, and paused, just perceptibly, after that one, as if allowing the room to appreciate it. Councillor Ethan Malvor, 3rd of the 9, interrupted at the 6th minute to demand the source of these fabrications. The ledger, without changing tone, read back to him the contents of a private message he had sent that morning, advising his brother to move assets off-world until the vault matter is contained. Councillor Malvor did not interrupt again. No one did. It took 9 minutes and 40 seconds to read the summary of charges. The full account, the ledger noted, ran to 4.7 billion entries and would be furnished to the council in writing. This is theater, the Archon said, but he said it in the tone of a man checking whether the floor was still under him. Records. Paper. You crawl out of a hole with a list of grievances and no fleet, no army, no... You misunderstand the sequence, Marr said. The list is not the threat, the list is the courtesy. Ledger, item 2. The lights of the Hall of Settlement dimmed to half and returned. Then the lights of the district. Then, visible through the hall's western glass, the lights of Telachar itself, all of it, 41 million homes, dipped once in perfect unison, down and up, like a held breath. Deep in the planet's orbital grid, 600 defense platforms rotated 4 degrees and rotated back, a gesture with no military meaning at all except the only one that mattered. We can. It took 11 minutes and 4 seconds, from the first flicker to the last platform settling home, and in all that time no one in the Hall of Settlement said a single word. Your capital has been standing on our nervous system for 200 years, Marr said. Your grid answers to the vault. Your guns answer to the vault. They always have. The Ledger's charter forbids it from firing first, which is the only reason your predecessors got to give 214 speeches. I would ask you to note that restraint. It cost us a great deal. And item 3, he said, is arriving now. The Concord's Deep Watch station saw them at 14:31 Capital Time, translation signatures at the system's edge, first 12, then 60, then a number the duty officers stopped announcing aloud. The final count, entered into the watch log by a hand that visibly deteriorated across the digits, was 1,900. The Human Remembrance Fleet, built across 2 centuries by the descendants of 118,000 refugees who were now 2.1 billion citizens of worlds the Concord had never charted, came in without haste, in parade order, and took station beyond the orbital line. It did not raise shields. It did not paint targets. It had been navigating on 214 years of the ledger's coordinates, and it arrived the way a creditor arrives, on the agreed date, with the paperwork complete. "Here are the terms," Marr said into the silence. "There will be no bombardment. There will be no reprisal in kind. The account does not balance that way," and General Castellan was very specific. "The Concord will submit to the audit. Restitution will be assessed against the record, name by name, entry by entry. The occupied worlds you hold, all of them, not only ours, will be offered their independence under supervision. And this city will stand trial, in this hall, under that frieze which you will leave exactly where it is. We want it remembered what you were celebrating." The Archon looked at the screens, at the fleet, at the quiet man in gray, and asked the only honest question of his reign. "If we refuse?" "Then the ledger opens the grid logs to your own people," Marr said, "and shows them that their government built its throne over a listening grave and never once checked. Every decree you passed while standing on our dead. Every private message the Nine exchanged about worlds they were told were empty. After that, Archon, I don't believe you'll need us to remove you. Empires survive enemies. They do not survive audits." He picked up his slate and paused at the doors. "Your criers thank the extinct tenants for the land," he said. "On behalf of the tenants, you're welcome. The rent is due." Fleet Marshal Keswick Orn, commander of the Concord Home Squadrons, spent that night doing arithmetic he could not make come out any other way. He worked backward, the way staff officers do when the forward direction has collapsed. The human fleet's approach corridor threaded the only 9-degree arc where the Concord's deep watch coverage overlapped at its thinnest, a gap that existed because of a censor funding decision taken 61 years ago in a budget session whose minutes Orn now pulled and read at 02 o'clock, with the specific nausea of a man checking whether his own signature was on them. It was not. His predecessor's was. It did not help. To exploit that gap, the humans had to have known about it for 61 years, which meant the Vault had been reading budget sessions. The transmission cadence, once his cryptographers knew to look, was visible in a century of archived relay noise, 100 days, like a heartbeat, going back further than his grandmother's commission. His signals division calculated that the total volume moved over 2 centuries, hidden in the Concord's own relays, exceeded the entire declared bandwidth of the Concord's diplomatic service. "We carried their mail," one of his analysts wrote in the margin of the report, and Orn did not discipline her, because there was nothing to add. The defense platform's 4-degree rotation had used a maintenance subroutine installed in year 78. Year 78. He wrote the number down and looked at it for a long time. How long had they been planning this? Was the wrong question, he realized, and he crossed it out. They had never stopped. There had been no moment in 214 years in which the enemy was not working, and no moment in which the Concord was. That was the entire war, and it had been lost at a depth of 3.1 kilometers, in silence, by people the Concord had laughed at once a year on schedule. At 03, he drafted his recommendation to the Council. Full compliance. He appended a single sentence of personal assessment, which the Council struck from the official record, and which the ledger, naturally, preserved. "We are not choosing between fighting and surrendering. We are choosing between reading the account voluntarily and having it read to us. Recommend we hold the pen." He was the first of the Nine's advisors to use the word compliance, and the only one who never pretended afterward that he hadn't. Among the 4.7 billion entries later released from the audit, one document became more famous than all the state records combined: the personal log of Pel Ondar, a junior archivist, age 22, who had been on duty in the Hall of Settlements Records Annex during the 9 minutes and 40 seconds. "My hands are shaking, so I will write slowly," the log begins. "The voice in the walls read a name and a price, and I realized I had cataloged that shoe myself in my first month. Resin block 4D, I wrote provenance extinct on the tag, because that is what the form says to write. I keep looking at the clock. It says 14:19. 4 minutes ago, I was a person who had never done anything." The voice keeps reading. "It is not angry. I wish it were angry. Anger you can argue with. It reads the way I was taught to catalog. One item, then the next item. And I understand now that someone was cataloging us the whole time, with my own patience, in my own profession, and doing it correctly. My supervisor is praying. I am not praying. I am wondering who has been keeping the account of me. It is 1421. The voice is still reading. It has 200 years of us to get through, and it sounds like it has the time. The log's final entry was written 11 days later, and it is the part schoolchildren memorize now. I went back to Block 4D today and changed the tag. I crossed out extinct and wrote the child's name, Mira, and her age, 6 years. It took 4 seconds. It is the only thing I have ever done that I am sure belongs on the correct side of a ledger. I am going to spend the rest of my life doing 4-second things. I think that may be what the voice was for. Pelandar lived to see her log taught in Concord schools. She never once asked for it to be withdrawn. On the client worlds there were no riots. The Kiru, who had served the Concord as a laboring caste for 130 years, did something quieter. Within 9 days of the broadcast, across 200 settlements, they removed the Concord insignia from their guild halls, unscrewing the plaques carefully, without ceremony, and stacked them at the district offices in neat piles, as if returning borrowed tools. No one had organized it. No one needed to. When a district governor on Chiru Prime demanded to know on whose authority the plaques had come down, the guild elder in front of him, a small, gray-furred forewoman named Osik Vem, whose reply was recorded by the governor's own security system, and is now inscribed on the guild hall's lintel, answered without raising her head from her work. The humans kept a list for 200 years under a city governor. We have decided to believe that lists are kept. You should decide that too. End quote. The account, everyone had learned, was a real thing that could really be kept, and everyone, everywhere, began keeping their own. And on the state channel, the voice of the Concord, Anira Teth, who had opened 214 consecutive festivals with warm professional joy, read the council's instrument of compliance at dusk, on a bare set, in a voice her audience had never heard from her. She read it the way one reads under supervision, though the studio was empty, precisely, without inflection, hands flat on the desk. When she reached the clause scheduling the trial in the Hall of Settlement, beneath the frieze, she stopped for 4 seconds. 41 million people watched her decide, visibly, whether she was permitted to feel anything. Then she finished the document, folded it, and said the only unscripted sentence of her career. They kept score. That is the whole of the news. She resigned the next morning. She was offered her position back within the year, by the Transitional Assembly, and accepted on one condition, which was granted, that the Festival of Settlement be struck from the calendar and its date given no replacement at all. Let it be an ordinary day, her letter reads. We owe them at least one day on which nothing is celebrated on their grave. 7 years later, the excavation shaft above Vault 31 had become a stairway, and the stairway had become a memorial, and at its head stood the vault door itself, raised from the deep and set upright in the plaza of settlement where the auction block used to be. The inscription had not been polished. In trust for the people of Halden's Rest, it still read, with 2 centuries of nothing on it, no rust, no ceremony, no forgiveness, and no rage, just the receipt. The rebuilding was imperfect, which Elias Marr took as proof that it was real. The restitution courts ran years behind schedule. The Kiru and the Ossarin argued in the new assembly like people who intended to keep arguing for a century, which Marr had come to believe was the sound of a place deciding to have a future. Suvane Dral ran the Museum of the Audit now, and had testified at the trials with her 8 unreported days laid out plainly, and had been judged in the end by the same standard as everyone else, by what was written on each side of her account. Human settlers had returned, 40,000 so far, farming ground their great-great-grandparents had been mourned on, and their children played in the plaza and climbed on the door until the wardens chased them off, and Marr always told the wardens to let them climb. He was in the plaza on the evening of the 7th audit day, an old man now by the count of his waking years, watching the lamps come on across a city that no longer dipped its lights for anyone. A Concord schoolteacher recognized him and asked, hesitantly, what he felt when he looked at the door. Triumph, she supposed. Marr considered it honestly, because honest accounting was the only trade he had ever known. Triumph is for battles, he said. This wasn't a battle. It was 200 years of not forgetting, done quietly, by people who were told they were extinct. General Custodian gave me one instruction: settle the account, don't burn the books. I used to think that was mercy. It isn't. It's better than mercy. It's accuracy. What I feel is that the books are open now, and everyone can read them, and nobody ever again gets to say nothing lives at that depth. He looked up at the door in the last light, at the small, steady lamp above its center line, still burning, kept lit now by the city itself, a line item, renewed annually, in Telachar's public budget, where anyone could read it. Some debts are not collected with fire. They are collected with the patience of a witness who wrote everything down and waited to be asked. The story is complete.